In a climate-controlled case at the British Museum in London sits a clay mask that is nearly 4,000 years old. The face on this mask has no eyes. It has no mouth in any recognizable arrangement. The entire surface is a single unbroken coil of ridged biological tissue spiraling inward. Visitors walk past it every day. Most never stop. But a cuneiform tablet in the same museum describes exactly what this face belongs to. The text says the gods themselves refused to enter the territory, this being controlled. It says its voice sounded like a flood, and its breath meant death. And it says one figure with human blood walked into that territory, stood before the creature, and came back to tell the scribes what he saw. They carved his account into clay, meant to last forever. It lasted. The mask sits in the room designated as the Ancient Near East Galleries. Room 56, a room of broken kings and forgotten dynasties. But this object is not a king's monument. It is a record. A document pressed in clay by scribes who believed they were preserving information that mattered enough to outlast them. They were right. It did outlast them, by nearly 4 millennia. The description of this entity does not come from a single broken fragment. It comes from multiple tablets copied across more than 1,000 years of scribal tradition. The oldest versions are Sumerian poems held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia and the Yale Babylonian Collection in New Haven. Scholars designate them as Gilgamesh and Huwawa, version A and version B. The later Akkadian account appears on Tablet 5 of the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, compiled from fragments across the British Museum, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and collections in Baghdad. But the most significant addition to this text came not from a museum vault. It came from a market in Iraqi Kurdistan. Around 2011, a clay tablet surfaced in the Sulaimaniya Museum, reportedly purchased from a local dealer. Scholars Farouk Al-Rawi and Andrew George of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London identified the fragment as a missing section of Tablet 5. They published it in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, Volume 66, in 2014. George called it one of the most important additions to the Gilgamesh epic in modern scholarship. 20 lines of cuneiform that had been absent for 3,000 years, suddenly legible again. Across every version, from the Sumerian originals to the standard Babylonian recension, the being at the center of the Cedar Forest narrative is described with a consistency that transcends scribal era. Its name in Sumerian is Huwawa. In Akkadian, it becomes Humbaba. And the texts tell us exactly what it looked like, how it moved, and what happened to the one being with human blood who saw it face to face. So before this story pulls you under, consider subscribing and make sure to like this video. Mainstream Assyriology has studied Humbaba for over a century. The dominant interpretation comes from scholars like Thorkild Jacobson, the late Harvard professor, whose 1976 work, The Treasures of Darkness, framed Humbaba as the embodiment of numinous terror. In Jacobson's reading, Humbaba represents the psychological dread of the untamed wild. The Cedar Forest is not a literal place, but a literary landscape representing the dangerous periphery beyond civilization. Gilgamesh's decision to enter that forest and kill its guardian is an act of civilizational hubris, a young king overstepping the boundary between the human world and forces that should remain undisturbed. Andrew George, the foremost living authority on the Gilgamesh epic and professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, reads the Cedar Forest as a narrative device. The journey there tests the hero. The guardian exists to be overcome. The 7 radiant auras that surround Humbaba are a literary motif, paralleling the 7 gates of the underworld and other structures built on the number 7 throughout Mesopotamian literature. The clay masks found at Sippar, Ur, and Babylon are, in this reading, apotropaic devices used in divination rituals. Not portraits, not forensic descriptions. Symbolic objects connected to the practice of reading sheep entrails, which is why the coiled face pattern resembles intestinal tissue. The god's reluctance to confront Humbaba is a literary convention expressing the sacredness of the wilderness, not evidence that divine beings were physically afraid of a real creature. This is a serious, well-supported interpretation, and it accounts for much of the textual evidence. Samuel Noah Kramer, the late professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who spent decades translating the Sumerian Gilgamesh poems, noted that the Huwawa material is among the most internally consistent narratives in the entire Sumerian literary corpus. Kramer observed that the scribal tradition treated this encounter not as fable, but as historical memory. He wrote that the Sumerians believed Gilgamesh had actually made this journey. Not symbolically, literally. That distinction matters when we examine what the texts say the journey contained, but not all of it. The Sumerian poems describe 7 distinct auras radiating from Huwawa. Each one functions as a separate defensive layer. When Gilgamesh approaches, the texts describe him stripping these auras one by one. With each removal, the creature weakens physically. This does not read like the dissipation of a symbolic motif. It reads like the sequential disabling of a layered system, where each component serves a protective function and can be isolated from the others. The Akkadian texts describe the effects of Humbaba's presence on the human body. Gilgamesh trembles. He experiences what the text renders as paralysis and dread that roots him in place. These are not metaphors floating in poetic space. They are physiological symptoms described in sequence. The voice of Humbaba is compared to a floodstorm. Its breath is called death. Ancient scribes used precise language when they described divine weapons and divine architecture. The question is whether they used the same precision when they described this creature. The Suleymaniya fragment sharpens this question considerably. The 20 new lines describe the Cedar Forest in ecological detail that scholars had never seen before. The text names specific animals. Monkeys call from the branches. A cicada chorus fills the canopy. Birds display exotic plumage in the upper reaches. George and Al-Rawi noted the naturalistic quality of this passage. This is not the vague mythological landscape that earlier translations suggested. This is a living environment described by someone who either witnessed it or received a detailed account from someone who did. The description of the forest floor is equally specific. The text renders the Cedar Mountain as a place where shade falls in multiple layers, where the fragrance of cedar fills every passage between the trees, and where the sound of the forest itself is constant and overwhelming. Gilgamesh and Enkidu stand at the edge of it, and the text says they were struck still. Not by supernatural force at that moment, by what they were seeing with their eyes. The forest was real enough to stop them before they entered. And within this precise ecological frame, Humbaba moves as absolute sovereign. If the forest around the creature is described with observational specificity, the creature itself sits within that same descriptive register. The masks at the British Museum take on a different weight in this context. A face made of a single continuous coil, no recognizable features, no bilateral symmetry of the kind that defines every mammalian face on Earth. Scholars connect this to the intestinal patterns of extispicy, and that connection is real. But the scribes who carved these masks had access to the same tablets that described Humbaba's appearance. They were not guessing, they were rendering. Zecharia Sitchin, the independent researcher who published The 12th Planet in 1976 and launched the Earth Chronicles series, proposed a structural reading that accounts for these details differently. In Sitchin's framework, the Cedar Forest was not a literary invention. It was a restricted Anunnaki zone in the mountain regions of what is now Lebanon. He connected it to the massive stone platform at Baalbek, where blocks weighing over 1,000 tons remain stacked in configurations that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. Humbaba, under this reading, was not a mythological creature. It was a bioengineered or technological guardian entity stationed to protect Anunnaki infrastructure. The 7 auras were not magical emanations. They were layered defensive perimeters, each one a distinct system designed to prevent unauthorized approach. This reading is not proven. It is not consensus scholarship, but it accounts for textual features that the conventional interpretation classifies as literary decoration without further examination. Michael S. Heiser, the late scholar of Semitic languages, pushed back against Sitchin's cuneiform interpretations with force and specificity. Heiser argued that Sitchin's rendering of key Sumerian terms was linguistically untenable. The word malamu, which describes the radiant aura of gods and powerful beings throughout Mesopotamian literature, does not translate to technological energy output. It refers to the visible manifestation of divine presence, a concept documented across hundreds of texts with consistent usage. The physiological reactions Gilgamesh experiences are paralleled in other ancient Near Eastern texts, describing encounters with the numinous. They are genre conventions, not medical reports. The ecological detail on the Suleymaniye fragment could reflect actual Mesopotamian knowledge of Levantine cedar forests, acquired through centuries of trade along routes connecting the Euphrates to the Mediterranean coast. These are strong objections. They address the specific claims at their foundations. But the physical description of Humbaba itself remains. And this is the forensic center of the entire question. The Sumerian poems use a term that scholars translate as a face of terror. The Akkadian version is more specific. The face is rendered as a single mass of coiled features, not scarred, not deformed in a way that implies injury, structured, organized around a pattern that is biological but follows no anatomy recognizable in the natural world. The clay masks at the British Museum make this visible. You can stand in front of them today. The face is one continuous ridge spiraling from the outer edge toward a central point. No eye sockets, no nasal bridge, no jawline. A configuration that exists nowhere in the fossil record and nowhere in the living animal kingdom. The 7 auras are described as removable. When Gilgamesh strips the first, Humbaba's power diminishes but does not collapse. When the second is removed, it diminishes further. This continues through all 7 layers. The sequential, quantifiable nature of this weakening reads less like the fading of a magical glow and more like the systematic shutdown of something engineered to function in stages. The text also records what Humbaba said when it realized those layers were being stripped away. It spoke. The tablets preserve its words. It told Gilgamesh that Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, had appointed it to this role. It had not chosen to be the guardian of the Cedar Forest. It had been placed there. This detail is easy to pass over, but it carries weight. The being at the center of this account did not emerge from the forest organically. It was stationed, assigned, deployed. Whatever Humbaba was, the texts say it was there because a god put it there and gave it a specific function to perform. And then there is the witness. Gilgamesh is described throughout the Mesopotamian tradition as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His mother was the goddess Ninsun. His father was the mortal king Lugalbanda. He carries divine blood and human blood simultaneously. He is not a god. He is not fully mortal. He is the only being in the textual tradition with human lineage who entered the Cedar Forest, confronted Humbaba directly, and returned to report what he experienced. The Sumerian term applied to him translates as the one who saw everything, the one who experienced the deep. Enkidu, his companion who fought beside him, was fashioned from clay by the goddess Aruru, a different category of being entirely. Not born, not carrying human ancestry, Gilgamesh alone stands as the human witness. The pattern does not end in Mesopotamia. In the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verse 24, the text describes cherubim stationed at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. They carry a flaming sword that turns in every direction. The structural architecture is identical. A divine authority creates a sacred garden. A terrifying guardian is stationed at its threshold. Entry is forbidden. The garden contains something of immense value that must be protected. Replace the Cedar Forest with Eden and Humbaba with the cherubim, and the narrative scaffolding is the same. Greek tradition preserves the same formula. Hesiod and Apollodorus both describe Ladon, the serpent with 100 heads who never slept, guarding the golden apples in the Garden of the Hesperides. A divine garden, a monstrous guardian, a treasure the gods wanted protected. Norse mythology records Fenrir, the great wolf whose growing power caused the Aesir gods themselves to convene in emergency. Even the divine assembly feared what this creature would become. The texts say they tried to bind Fenrir twice before he broke free. The third binding required a chain crafted from things that do not exist. The silence of a cat. the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, things that leave no trace. Even in the Norse account, the gods could not subdue their own creation through ordinary force. In the Book of Enoch, chapters 17 through 36, the prophet describes guardian beings stationed at cosmic boundaries so terrifying that even the watchers would not approach. The Valmiki Ramayana renders the physical form of Ravana with the same anatomical specificity that the cuneiform tablets apply to Humbaba. 10 heads, 20 arms, a body whose geometry exceeds the human frame. These cultures had minimal or no documented contact with one another, yet the structural formula repeats. The gods station a guardian so powerful that even they acknowledge its danger. Cognitive scientists like Pascal Boyers argue that these convergences reflect universal features of human cognition. Threat detection at boundaries is hardwired into every human brain. Joseph Campbell's monomyth positions the threshold guardian as a universal narrative stage, an archetype that emerges independently because human psychology is human psychology everywhere. These are rigorous, well-supported frameworks. They explain why the guardian category exists in so many traditions, but they explain the category without explaining the engineering. Multiple cultures separated by oceans and millennia do not merely describe guardians. They describe guardians with layered defenses, guardians with non-human facial geometry, guardians whose power exceeds the beings who created them. The archetype explains the impulse. It does not explain the specifications. What Boyer and Campbell cannot account for is the administrative detail. The guardians in these traditions are not wild creatures that wandered to a threshold and stayed. They are stationed, appointed, given a jurisdiction and a function. The cherubim in Genesis are placed there by divine command. Ladon is set to his task. Humbaba is told by Enlil that the Cedar Forest is his domain and his responsibility. The cross-cultural convergence is not merely that monstrous guardians appear at sacred boundaries. It is that they appear there because a higher authority put them there and gave them instructions. That is a different kind of pattern, and it is not explained by cognitive universals alone. The Suleymaniya tablet sat in a dealer's collection before Al-Rawi and George identified it. For an unknown number of years, it was simply merchandise, an artifact from the deep past moving through the commerce of the present. 20 lines of cuneiform containing details about an encounter between a being with human blood and a creature that terrified the gods. Those lines had been missing from the human record for roughly 3,000 years. They surfaced in a Kurdish market and changed the shape of one of the oldest stories ever told. The masks at the British Museum are Old Babylonian, approximately 4,000 years old. Fired clay pressed into the likeness of a face that has no parallel in biology. Visitors move through the Mesopotamian galleries on their way to the Rosetta Stone or the Elgin marbles. Most never stop at the small case where the coiled face sits behind glass. The label describes it as a protective mask, apotropaic, a word most people do not read. But somewhere in the cuneiform record, a scribe sat with a reed stylus and pressed into wet clay the description of what a partly human king saw when he entered a forest the gods themselves would not approach. The creature he found there had a face that followed no living pattern. It radiated 7 layers of force that could be dismantled one at a time. Its voice shook the ground, and its breath carried death. The scribe carved every detail. He did not explain what the creature was. He did not interpret what it meant. He recorded what the witness reported, and he sealed it in clay. The tablets survived. The masks survived. The translations have been published and peer-reviewed, and they sit on open shelves in university libraries from London to Philadelphia. Everything the ancient scribes wanted to preserve has been preserved. The face behind the glass at the British Museum has not changed in 4,000 years. It is still coiled. It is still unrecognizable. And the cuneiform beside it still says the same thing it said when the clay was wet.